Greetings, friends of liberty. When I look around me at Britain, here in the late 18th century, there is no question that a political party which labelled itself Reform could find no end of problems needing reform. And yet, before I turn to those things that can use reforming, I should mention, happily, one area of Britain that no longer needs reforming, and that is the corruption of judges by gifts and bribes. Now, it used to be the case that such bribery was tolerated, as was said, for example, of judges under the Stuarts. The ambidextrous judges bribed, rebribed, and lesser gifts to greater still subscribed. Among the corrupt, we might mention, of course, those judges who approved Charles I's unconstitutional use of ship money, they later being impeached by the Long Parliament. But by 1785, a century later, there had been so much improvement in judicial rectitude that, as Reverend Martin commented, our judges are not only respectable with regard to their office, but are so incorrupt as magistrates that they are what Caesar said his wife ought to be, not only chaste, but unsuspected. And partly I would wager our judges became chaste and even unsuspected simply because their salaries had been raised considerably. They were no longer tempted. But aside from the improvement in the probity of judges, whatever its cause, there are nonetheless serious problems touching on other forms of political corruption, whose urgency needs addressing. One notorious form is the governmental granting of sinecures and pensions to persons entirely undeserving who do little or no work for their salary. So, for example, if we read from the secret lists of the radical Black Dwarf, who comments on such corrupt individuals, he says that Lord Liverpool is set down as First Lord of the Treasury at £6,000 a year. Now, one as simple as myself would think that there was business enough in the Treasury for the First Lord, and the £6,000 a year was as much as Lord Liverpool was worth to the state. But God help our poor optics, which cannot distinguish the value and abilities of these lordly things. After discharging all the business of the Treasury, as First Lord, man pocketing the £6,000 a year, I find him with enough time in his hands to be a Commissioner of Affairs in India, with room enough in his pocket for £1,500 more every year. I have scarcely recovered my astonishment at this when I am also informed that he's also time to discharge the duty of a warden of the Cinque Ports, which consists, I am told, of putting £4,100 a year more in his bottomless purse. But even this is not all. He has leisure enough, by working over hours, I suppose, to be clerk of the rolls in Ireland, for which he pockets £3,500 a year more. There are people who say that these are not only so many excuses for giving the fellow the salaries. They whisper that he neither keeps the rolls of Ireland, nor tends to the affairs of India, nor knows anything about the Cinque Ports, and that a deputy does all this work at the Treasury for a few hundred a year, which is also paid by the country. But banish all mention of such doings. Surely they are rank gossip, by such as our informant the Black Dwarf. No, there can be no doubt that Lord Liverpool earns every shilling of his thousands. No doubt at all. Now, aside from governmental sinecures, there is also the fact that the British democracy works through boroughs, with members of Parliament elected to represent a borough. The problem, however, is that boroughs can be vastly unequal in size, with a pocket or rotten borough representing as few as 6 people, but a normal borough representing as many as 12,000. Thus, giving the pocket borough much more electoral influence than it should have. and thus rendering it more susceptible to direct manipulation. So the desire to make boroughs more uniform in size remains a needed reform. Now, if we turn from the problems requiring reform in the year of our Lord 1793 in England to those of the year 2025 in modern England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, we find today Milestones, 9 Steps to Fix Britain, written by former MP for Harwich, Douglas Carswell, who's now taken a sabbatical in Mississippi to run the Mississippi Center for Public Policy, a free market think tank. Douglas says of Britain, for the past 3 decades, our nation has endured an ideological onslaught, a revolution cloaked as progress. Men, we have told, but can become women. The ancient legal principle of equality under the law has been cast aside. Those with protected characteristics are now treated preferentially. The Bank of England, granted independence, presided over a banking crisis and lost control of inflation. A climate change committee shapes energy policy, driving up costs and destroying what remained of our manufacturing. The leftist revolution began with Tony Blair's 1997 landslide victory. They opened our borders, allowing millions of immigrants in, believing that anyone can become British or even English, Scottish, or Welsh. The NHS, run by its own unaccountable bureaucracy, is failing. Britain's armed forces are a shadow of their former selves. None of this is inevitable. The dire condition of the country is a consequence of abysmal policy, inept leadership, and an administrative class that has lost all accountability to the people it claims to represent. So in response, Douglas proposes 9 reforms he calls the milestones to fix these problems. Let's proceed by describing each. Reform number 1, securing public administration. What Carswell means by this is that, since he believes that Whitehall, the administrative state with all its departments and bureaucrats, will fight reform every step of the way, an incoming administration should use royal prerogative, which is a kind of executive order issued by the king, and orders in council, where the prime minister suggests policies as head of the Privy Council to the king as a condition for forming a government. The government would then specifically change the Civil Service Management Code and the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010. 2, number 1, allow the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers to issue direct orders to bureaucrats waiving their discretionary resistance. 2, if they wouldn't obey, it would allow them to be quickly dismissed. And 3, the Prime Minister could also appoint and put his own chosen experts directly in the place of the fired bureaucrats. Carswell claims that the Ministers of the Crown Act 1975 permits departmental dissolution and function transfers without parliamentary approval. This, too, would be done by presenting the king with a pre-drafted order in council on day 1, listing departments to be abolished. Parliament would need to be informed post facto. Using these powers, the new administration would then dissolve at least 8 departments, approximately 1/3 of the total, including the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and others. Number 4, in addition, although the House of Lords conventionally is not obstructive, Carswell believes we can no longer count on convention. An incoming administration should prepare to pack the House of Lords with hundreds of new peers to secure a majority for its agenda by using the Prime Minister's power to nominate new life peers. Reform number 2, securing our borders. Carswell states that the Trump administration deported approximately 50,000 illegal immigrants within the first month. We need to take similar steps to begin to remove the estimated 500,000 to 1 million illegal immigrants residing in the UK. Carswell argues for 3 specific orders in council to do this and to control immigration inflows in general. A, 1 under the Immigration Act 1971 to enforce stringent visa requirements, including financial self-sufficiency thresholds. B, another, to set an immigration ceiling of 50,000 immigrants, mainly from Western countries. And C, another, to begin removing all illegal migrants by expediting various processes, reducing length of appeals and notices, expanding the safe countries list, and reducing or eliminating the indefinite leave to remain unless migrants can show economic self-sufficiency or cultural integration. He also, in addition, recommends an act of Parliament to amend the Tribunals, Courts and Enforcement Act 2007. The ability of the immigrants to appeal pre-removal, often on human rights grounds under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, results in prolonged stays, with 60% of deportation appeals failing yet still delaying enforcement. This legislation must require that all appeals against deportation orders for illegal entrance be heard only after the individual has been removed from the UK, so by videophone or conferencing from another country. Carswell confronts yet another institutional challenge, that of reforming the judiciary, which, after Blair's changes in the case of immigration and other policies, has repeatedly been used to thwart government policy. For example, with regard to immigration in 2022, a high court ruling halted the government's initial Rwanda deportation flights, finding inadequate evidence of the policy's fairness and safety. This was all caused by the Constitutional Reform Act 2005, which transferred judicial appointments from the Lord Chancellor to the JAC, an independent body that lacks democratic accountability. We need to abolish the JAC and restore judicial appointment powers to the Lord Chancellor, accountable to Parliament. In addition, he proposes a Judicial Conduct and Tenure Act to allow the Lord Chancellor to remove senior judges whose adjudication is based on activism rather than narrowly interpreting what the law says. Reform number 3, undoing the Blairite legislative legacy. With these now increased powers over Whitehall and the judiciary, the Lord Chancellor, if he shares Carswell's views and with parliamentary assent, will move to repeal the toxic legislative legacy of the past 2 decades. He proposes to attack the Human Rights Act, which embeds judicial oversight, the Communications Act, which stifles free speech, the Climate Change Act, which imposes burdens and net zero targets, and the Equality Act, which undermines meritocracy. Let's review each. Number 1, repeal the Human Rights Act 1998 and replace it with the British Sovereignty Act. This new law would mandate that judges adjudicate solely based on UK statutes and common law precedents, free from European Convention human rights influence, while preserving fundamental rights like fair trials and free expression as defined domestically. Number 2, Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003 criminalizes online speech deemed grossly offensive, leading to over 3,000 arrests annually for social media posts, many of which involve subjective offenses. We must amend Section 127 to protect all expressions of opinion regardless of perceived offensiveness, unless they meet a high threshold of direct harm. Number 3, we must repeal the Climate Change Act 2008 in its entirety, eliminating net zero targets, carbon budgets, and the Climate Change Committee. Replace it with a pragmatic energy policy focused on affordability and security, allowing market-driven innovation to address emissions without statutory mandates. And number 4, we must repeal the Equality Act 2010 and enact a meritocracy law stating, it shall be unlawful to discriminate against any individual in employment, housing, education, or public services on the basis of race, ethnicity, or gender. This shall prohibit public bodies from recruiting, managing, or promoting individuals on any basis other than merit, assessed via objective performance metrics, in other words, qualifications output. Reform number 4, unleash an economic reform through radical deregulation. These reforms are straightforward enough and come from Carswell's small government inclinations. Number 1, housing. The UK's housing shortage, estimated at 4.3 million homes, is partly caused by restrictive planning laws, environmental impact assessments, delay projects, while greenbelt policies prevent housing being built where people might actually want to live. Affordable housing mandates further deter development, inflating costs by 20 to 30%. On top of that, infrastructure projects face years of delay from bureaucratic hurdles. What to do then to clear this red tape and regulatory morass? Essentially eliminate the above effects. So a Planning Deregulation Act is needed to amend the Town and Country Planning Act 1990 to A. Simplify environmental impact assessments, then repeal most greenbelt restrictions, freeing land for housing while preserving only high-value ecological zones. B. Abolish affordable housing obligations. C. Classify major infrastructure as nationally significant infrastructure projects under the Planning Act 2008, bypassing local councils and accelerating approvals. And D, on top of that, the Act needs to deregulate housing design codes, allowing architects to prioritize customer preferences over compliance checklists. Number 2, energy. An Energy Freedom Act would, A, amend the Town and Country Planning Regulations 2007 to exclude downstream emissions from assessments, enabling new North Sea oil and gas drilling. B, revise the Petroleum Act 1998 to permit fracking without local vetoes. And C, remove site requirements for small nuclear reactors under the Nuclear Installations Act 1965, allowing construction in any location meeting safety criteria. Number 3, red tape. A red tape audit would reduce or eliminate the 19,000 EU regulations, many of which stifle innovation, and would establish a red tape task force to conduct a line-by-line audit of retained EU laws within 6 months. Finally, number 4, employment. Increase labor market flexibility by eliminating unfair dismissal claims, which are costing employers £1.2 billion annually. Tribunal awards, uncapped since 2004, deter hiring. An act is needed to introduce a 90-day at-will dismissal period for new hires, allowing termination without cause, modeled on U.S. employment law. Reform number 5, reduce public spending. Today, government spending accounts for 45% of GDP. To hit 40% by 2028-2029, the government would need to cut spending by at least $130 billion. But to also pave the way for tax cuts, we should aim higher, trimming $170 billion in total. What to trim? Along with the aforementioned closing of 8 departments, saving $30 billion, he would reduce disability benefits, housing benefits, eliminate the majority of overseas aid, reduce Quango funding, reduce universal credit, freeze public sector pay, and reduce the public sector workforce. So $170 billion savings, with $40 billion going back to the taxpayer in tax cuts. Reform number 6, the aforementioned tax cuts. These cuts are complicated by the fact that defense spending needs to be increased. In order to get more revenues or savings, he recommends A, cutting tariffs to 0, B, raising the 40% income tax threshold from £50,000 to £57,000 over the term of a parliament, C, abolishing the personal 45% rate, D, reducing the corporation rate to 20% from 25%, and E, finally, reducing the VAT. Reform number 7 of the public sector. Number 1, what should Britain do with the NHS? With a healthcare service where decades of bureaucratic inefficiency and resistance to innovation have left it struggling to meet the needs of a growing aging population. Carswell suggests 5 key reforms. Number 1, remove the cap on training doctors, which stands now at 7,500. Number 2, use and commission private providers more widely. Number 3, allow private providers to enter the healthcare market freely, competing directly for patients rather than negotiating contracts with intermediaries. This would lower prices because of more competition while using the more efficient private providers. Number 4, guarantee patients the right to use their NHS allocated funds to seek private treatment if waiting times for elective procedures, such as hip replacements or cataract surgeries, exceed a reasonable threshold. And 5, Singapore-style health accounts, where people are mandated to contribute to 5 to 10% to health savings accounts, which they could use for smaller purchases, with larger still covered by regular insurance. Number 2, and what about Britain's educational system? He argues, parents, not government, are responsible for the education and upbringing of their children. We need to return to this fundamental principle if Britain is to be the sort of society it once was. We need to convert all state schools into standalone institutions free from local authority control, managed by independent foundations. School choice, then, is the answer. A Parental Choice Act would empower parents to request the per-pupil funding allocation, about £6,000 to £7,000 per year for primary or secondary pupils, from their local education authority. Local education authorities would have to transfer that funding to the school of choice, whether state, independent, or newly established. Schools would not be required to follow a national curriculum, but faith-based schools, particularly Muslim schools, would be vetted to ensure that they do not teach extremist ideology. Reform number 8, strengthen defense, realign foreign policy. Our overarching foreign policy goal should be to pursue free trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and unrestricted movement for citizens among the core Anglosphere countries: Britain, America, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. He believes that military spending should rise to 3% of GDP, that it should prepare 4 divisions, 1 defense, 2 European, and 1 expeditionary, and that it should invest in emerging technologies. Finally, reform number 9, reintegration and migration. Carswell argues we need to not only deport those in the country illegally, but take away the right to live here enjoyed by those that prove to be a net burden economically, or who fail to assimilate, or who sympathize with terrorism and with the aims of Islamic radicals. How does he want to achieve that? A, he says the UK should offer migrants a certain amount of money like Sweden did to leave, saying, launch a voluntary remigration scheme offering £20,000 per individual or £50,000 per family to immigrants from Muslim-majority countries willing to repatriate permanently. B, in addition, we must legislate to ensure automatic deportation for non-naturalized immigrants convicted of crimes with sentences exceeding 3 months effective upon sentence completion. C, he also says that economically unproductive migrants should be deported by establishing a public burdens test to revoke residency for illegal immigrants reliant on welfare or social housing for over 12 consecutive months unless they demonstrate sustained economic contribution. D, he says restrict access to housing and welfare for all foreign-born residents unless they meet a minimum contribution threshold, in other words, 3 years of uninterrupted tax payments. Revoke residency for those failing to achieve net fiscal neutrality. E, revoke citizenship of those supportive of political Islamism or who promote violence against apostates, dissenters, free speech advocates, or minorities. He's suggesting the creation of an independent panel to judge when to revoke citizenship. And so there we are, Douglas Carswell's 9 reforms to save Britain. Now let's do a bit of review and analysis. Number 1, the big picture view, zooming way out, is that Britain, like many Western countries, is in significant ways a highly regulated welfare state. This is the fundamental problem. Government is much too big. And it has been a welfare state now for a long, long time, transitioning since the 1920s and 30s when the socialistic ideas of the Labour government became ever more popular. This means that many of the institutions which used to be private and more effective, like the healthcare system, were socialized or nationalized. And to a lesser degree, the same occurred in the U.S. under the progressives, with central banking being established in 1913, the American National Old Age Pension System of Social Security set up in 1935, governmental charity for the poor after World War II, and especially in the 1960s, and healthcare with the establishment of Medicare, Medicaid, and forced employee contributions taken from one's paycheck starting in the 1940s, which have resulted in skyrocketing healthcare costs. In addition, in England, many other types of property rights too, such as the ability to possess firearms and to use all types of now illegal drugs, were radically curtailed. The societal results are essentially 2, for Britain in the U.S. A coming disastrous national bankruptcy, and B, the decreasing effectiveness, sometimes in absolute terms, but certainly compared to what they could have been, of societal institutions. If Britain and America had remained libertarian. Now, it would have been nice, along with all his proposals, if Douglas had just given the summary I've given, since it would help people understand why Britain is increasingly broken, and thus the strategy and rationale for reform. Number 2, so when we concentrate on Douglas's specific proposals, most of them are consistent or in the direction of what a libertarian would suggest. Privatize everything as much as politically possible. And that brings up the basic problem, politics. Britons are not classical liberal or libertarian enough, just like most citizens of the U.S. are not. So that puts a limit on what you can achieve politically without philosophical change. The biggest problem of all is intellectual, the political philosophy of the citizenry, a typical example being how much Britons historically loved the pathetic NHS. A. First, in the same way the welfare state has damaged so much of Britain, it has actually also damaged Britain's immigration results, since the simple reality which Douglas never articulates is that without state welfare, not only would so many more native Britons not be on fake disability, but the country would not attract half as many bad migrants who want to get that welfare, like happens also in many of the welfare states of continental Europe. Instead, with no welfare state, Britain would attract largely hard-working migrants, which means there never would have been a migrant problem without the welfare state, as there never was in the U.S. when it did not have a welfare state from 1850 to 1924. And so all the specific means testing that he wants to apply to migrants is understandable, but if you just go for the more ambitious and comprehensive reform of getting rid of the welfare state, you'd stop the millions of migrants and native Britons who are now exploiting the system, and you'd stop attracting bad migrants in the future. B. As horrific as it may sound, letting all responsible Britons use firearms would radically reduce rates of robbery, burglary, and sexual assault, which are now orders of magnitude greater than they were 125 years ago when most Britons could own firearms. In addition, if anyone in Britain really wants to smash the gangs, in part it's easy to do. Take away their huge illicit profits by legalizing all drugs. No major British politician or reformer has the wisdom or courage to propose either of these two things. C, on education. Douglas gets it exactly right. Implement school choice as much as possible, returning control of elementary education to parents in the private sector. But he completely misses a crucial point on higher education in failing to point out that the public support of universities, which Britain only has significantly had since World War II, is responsible for creating many of the precise ideologies he laments. So when he says, for the past 3 decades, our nation has endured an ideological onslaught, a revolution cloaked as progress, he makes the mistake of completely failing to understand that the vastly increased support for public education was the cause of this ideological onslaught. D. Similarly on healthcare's attempts to introduce some reforms freeing up the system are good, but it would be better at least to treat it like school choice, in just giving people a sum of money so they can spend it the way they wish. And he advocates this, but only for overdue or postponed surgeries. This shifting of funds would cause a transition to private sector healthcare and hospitals, which would be highly beneficial and cost-effective in the long run, and which would, thank God, slowly eliminate the NHS. E. He's utterly right to want to radically reduce the size of Whitehall. In the power of the administrative state, his suggestion is by 1/3, but of his attempts to use royal prerogative in orders in council, I haven't been able to discover definitively whether this would be legal or whether it would provoke a constitutional crisis. F. He's right, of course, as well, to get rid of net zero and to try to reduce red tape, regulation, and taxes on business individuals as much as possible. G. Finally, he's right to want to get rid of the European Convention on Human Rights and the Equality Act and replace it with the Meritocracy Act, but this would only apply to public agencies, or it should, Civil society and private individuals should be free to discriminate if they wish. Freedom means the freedom to be wrong. Happy for my part that here in late 18th century Britain, we love freedom and understand its value in a way that modern Britons, both on the right and left, have sadly forgotten. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.